My name is Kurt. I'm a consultant for Devo team. I'll be telling you a little bit about AGPM for the coming hour. Okay. So you can see my blog there. Nothing special to see. Just find some, some screencasts about AGPM. That's also a little bit about my background. I'm a consultant mainly dealing with management infrastructure, meaning from PowerShell to group policy to technologies that manage your infrastructure, whether it be server end or client side. That's actually my focus. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? Actually quite simple, 3 things. What is AGPM about? Why the heck would I need it? And how do I implement this? And so my focus really for this session is that when you walk out the door this evening, that you have sufficient, I won't say all the knowledge, but that you have sufficient knowledge to be able to understand what it is, that you understand the architecture, and that you actually can play around with it in your lab, that you know how to install it. I'll walk through the installation with you together. There's some key components to understand in that. And then, of course, that you also know about how to configure and how to use it afterwards. So it's really to already help you to go and implement, play around with this in your test environment, in your production environment, if you want to live on the edge, really. So that's the purpose of this upcoming hour. So first of all, I think you remember, seen this slide many times. Meanwhile, it's about this portion, which is part of the MDOP suite, and it's called AGPM. Again, if you are under software assurance for your client, some kind of an enterprise agreement or whatever, you're entitled to the use of this for both the server and the client. And the second technical difficulty. And the second, way better. Now I can hear myself speak. Great. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, what is this AGPM? And why do we actually need it? Well, before answering that question, let me ask you another question. Who today here in this room is actually using group policy? Just raise your hand. Most of you. Who actually is using group policy preferences? Okay, way less. Now, when you deploy group policies, I think you all know the impact of a group policy is quite drastic. A couple of clicks, and within the hour, most of your machines, whether it be 10, 100, or 1,000, those machines actually, well, they have your couple of clicks, and they might do what they're supposed to do, or they might just blow up your environment as it is. So the problem with Group Policy Management Console, because, by the way, who is actually using Group Policy Management Console? Who is using other tools than GPMC? No one? Okay. Then this is definitely interesting for you guys. So it's a typical approach that Microsoft has taken with GPMC, is this one size fits all, meaning that whether you have an environment of 100 or 10 machines or 1,000, we're all using the same tool. Everyone in this room is using GPMC, and it has its limitations. One of the most obvious one is that, well, it's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot, meaning that you're making changes on a live environment, and a couple of clicks later, that is again in your live environment. So you have to find ways around this, work around this, to deal with, let's say, version control. Copy an existing policy that you want to change and roll that first version of the new group policy out to a couple of machines, whether it be users or their computers. So you don't really have track of the changes that you make. Everything happens live. Now, why? Simply because within GPMC there is no notion of change and release management. It's just, it's a tool for creation of policies and for the editing of your policies. Nothing else. There's no kind of workflow where someone is going to do an approval or where someone will actually approve if I'm going to delete a policy or deploy it in production or review what I've actually put in this policy. You're doing everything really live. So because of this missing part of the change and release management, you don't have any capabilities of history and rollback. Meaning that, well, if something goes wrong, something goes wrong. Hopefully you have an older version of this group policy so you can roll back, but that's something you have to, well, work around for yourself. You have to make sure that you've taken a copy of this previous version of the group policy. It's not built into the technology as itself. And of course, again, limited reporting. When you make changes in that environment, live, there's no way for you to see who changed what exact settings in which portions of the group policy. Is it at the user level? Is it at the computer level? Who changed it? When did he do that? What did he actually do? So we are having a lot of, challenges for enterprises when we deal with GPMC. And so that's actually why we introduced AGPM. AGPM is not new. It's one of those acquisitions that have been done, I think, 5 or 6 years ago now. And it's one of those products that also went into the suite for MDOP. So AGPM will introduce, of course, many of those functionalities. Like I said, we're going to do version control. And so this version control, similar like what you would do in SharePoint when you check out a document and you check it back in, we're going to do exactly the same for AGPM. We're going to check out the group policy. While it's checked out, we can now edit it. And if we're pleased with the results, we're going to check it back in to the archive, and then we decide what we do with that. We want to deploy it, maybe test it on a couple of machines, as you wish. But because we're now doing this version control, we have a history. And this history gives us the capability to do rollback if we need to roll back. If we encounter a specific problem, even though we've tested it over and over again, even though we still have a problem, we have this history and we could roll back to a previous version of this group policy. It's still the same group policy, but we just have the history of the changes that we made. And we can go back to the exact version that we still know worked fine yesterday in production. Now, it means that we're moving a lot of the work from the GPMC into this product. And so we're also having to deal with a lot of different people. People that are maybe GPO admins, group policy administrators, but maybe some people are more help desk related or, application owners. Someone is delivering me the application for Office, and they also wanted to have some settings in the registry through group policy for Office. So typically I would create a group policy for this application owner, and I would delegate him the rights to actually set the settings that need to be set in this group policy. So I am dealing with different roles in my organization, and that's also what AGPM will allow me to do. I have this role-based delegation model allowing me to really fine-tune in a very granular way the administration. Who is allowed to do what? Can anyone just create a group policy? No. Can anyone just change it? No. Can anyone just deploy it? Of course, no. That's all what this role-based delegation model is about. So it's pretty flexible, as I'll show you later on. And of course, the benefits of this is quite obvious, that there's less risk into this. Because, oh yeah, did I mention that from now on, with AGPM, we're no longer changing the policies live in production. We're doing this offline. We're going to create our own policy store, kind of an archive, in which we take specific group policies under our control. Under control mean AGPM. And now we're going to change those policies by checking them out, editing them, and checking them back in. This way we have the version control, we have this history, and we're able to, roll back the changes. But how do you mean roll back? Everything is still offline. Yeah, you're right. Everything is still offline. If we're pleased with the result, we can decide to now deploy that in production. And who can deploy it in production? Well, the one that has received the role, the privilege, the right to actually do so. So that's also part of this. So you really reduce the risk of, widespread failure of shooting yourself in the foot. That's what I was talking about. Okay. So the real advantages, this is a kind of a summary about every topic that I'm going to talk about, is that, of course, we're now able to deal with change management. We're able to create this library. We can even use templates inside this library. And the template, I'll come back to this later as well. But we have version control, tracking. I have a history. I can see the difference between different versions of a group policy object. So I create this group policy object for Office. And today, the application owner, he populated it, and this is what went into production. But now, a couple of days later, he's changing again that group policy. What are the differences? I would like to know as well. So I want to be able to see in a very simple report what are the things that he's added, what are the things that he's removed, and maybe what's the things that he's just changed. A new value, maybe instead of disabled, it's now suddenly enabled for Outlook caching or whatever. So I want to see all of that in a very structured and simple way. Of course, it's about administrative control, to be able, in a granular way, role-based, to deal with group policies. And if this is just a junior admin who I don't allow to create group policies, well, instead of creating a group policy, his, how should I say, his experience will be that when he tries to create a group policy in the same way as I do, he will actually send me an email. And I will get into this workflow where he's requesting me to create a group policy because he's not allowed to. And so when I would check my email box, I would actually then see, okay, there's apparently a creation of a group policy action pending. I would go into the console, I would approve or reject, depending on what I see fit. I would, in this case, let's say approve it, and this way actually the policy would get created. And so this same workflow, based on request approval, as you can see there, would be not only for the creation of group policy, but also for deletion of group policies, even for deploying in production. It is a very controlled way of dealing with group policies. And that's what AGPM is all about. Change and release management for your group policy infrastructure. Of course, because we're doing all of this offline, as you see, it's quite important. Now, even we have the capability of doing a recovery of a deleted GPO. Since everything sits in this archive, when you delete stuff and I have a history, I can even go back to the deleted version of a group policy. Even if it would be deleted in production, I can recover from this archive. There is this kind of a recycler bin, if you want to call it that way, that we will have available in AGPM. So, let's just have a look at the architecture. And I don't really have a lot of slides, I want to mainly show you a lot of things. So this is a very important slide for you to get the rest of this presentation. So, on the right side, something you're definitely familiar with, your production environment, where your group policies live on the domain controller. Portion of them sits in sysvol, another portion sits in the directory itself. And so, of course, we don't want to touch production. We just want to keep a kind of an archive with all our group policies that we want to take under our control. We don't have to take everything under our control. Eventually we would like to, but we don't have to. And so that's why we introduced this AGPM server. Now, a server is a big word for just a service. It's not really that big of a thing, but for the logic here, it's the AGPM server. And of course, we connect to this AGPM server through an AGPM client. Again, AGPM client, as you will see during the installation, is just a little simple add-on into the GPMC. So it's the same familiar place you used to be, but we have a little node for change control. And so, once we then connect to this AGPM server, we actually are looking at what is in this archive. Because this archive is, is going to be changed, edited, offline at all times, and we decide which of these group policies we're going to synchronize, or we're going to, not synchronize, import, so it's one direction for now, which ones we're going to take under our control in the archive, and which we're going to manage and edit using the AGPM client. And once we've done that offline, we can decide, once we're pleased with the result, to deploy it back into production. So only when we think that we are ready, we're going to push this back into production. So we don't touch production, we just read from it into the archive, and then we always work on the archive. Okay? If there's any questions, stop me while I'm doing the presentation. So, yeah, first question?
How can you test it if it's offline?
Okay.
You say if you're confident, then we push it to production?
Yeah. So there's a very good question. There's actually, how should I put this? There's two answers to this question. Or you're going to work in the traditional way. meaning that you have this kind of a test environment, a test domain on which you're going to deploy your group policies. And you're actually going to see what the result is, and if you're happy with the result, I'm okay with that. Now I move this into production, and then in production I should know what the result is. That's one way. That's maybe not the answer you want to hear from me because it's offline, so that doesn't help me. Well, later on I'll show you a little behind the scenes of what AGPM is really doing, and as you will find out is that when you check out a group policy to edit it, for just a split second it puts it in the sysvol. And so it would mean that it becomes visible to a production environment. So at that moment I could decide to link this checked out group policy just for a split second to a specific OU or a domain or a set of users on which you want to test it, and that would be a way to actually validate it. But again, as I'll show you later on, it's only for the time that the group policy is checked out. From the minute that someone checks it back into the archive, it disappears from production. And while it sits there in production, what I mean really is just in the sysvol. Just an object in the group policy object, not linked, nothing, just a temporary object for me to be able to edit. And it will make more sense later on. Okay, was that an answer to your question? There was another question at the back? Yeah?
Is it possible to use the AGPM client to edit the policies while not being in the domain or being in another domain?
So the question is, can I use the AGPM client if I'm not necessarily in a domain or not in the same domain? Well, everything is relating to trusts, right? So I would need a trust to be able to connect. If I'm not in a domain, I'm trying to figure out what you're really trying to do here. So you have what, a management workstation or something that is not in the domain?
Yeah, for example, if you're trying to edit a group policy from another domain, which is from, for instance, a total different department or company with no trust relationship exists. So just not possible.
No, you would have to have your own AGPM server in that domain. So I could not have one central AGPM server who is connecting to multiple domains. I think that's what you're referring to. You have many customers and you have all domains, or within an organization you have many domains. If there is a trust between those domains, of course, obvious. But if there's no trust, no, there's no way for me to do that. Okay. Other questions? Okay, then let's continue. So, let's start straight into it and see how we install this thing. So it's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of special things to see here. So for the AGPM server to do the installation, you need to be a domain admin, as you can see from the slide. Why? Well, because we're going to hook into the domain. We're going to hook into sysvol. For that, I need to have quite some privileges. And by the way, I'm going to go actually the other way around. In this architecture, I'm showing this on a dedicated server, and that's a best practice, but it's technically perfectly possible to put this also on a domain controller. Of course, putting different softwares on one and the same machine, that's all great until you have to upgrade and then one thing blocks the other. So yes, it is supported, but for your sake, a virtual machine with just a little bit of resources will just do fine. Because there's no database to be found here, there's no SQL or SQL Express here. Everything is really local in this store. All configuration is kept locally. The only thing that this will keep or take is a bit of disk space. It's going to be a history, an archive of a lot of policies. When I keep 1,000 versions of your policies over a couple of years, it's going to take a bit of space, of course. But that's it. So the installation, as I said, you move into it, you accept to the license agreement, and you select an installation path. Nothing special there. Now the second step is an archive path. As I said, AGPM is nothing more than an archive. So we're going to synchronize or import better specific policies that we take under our control, and we're going to put this in that specific path. If you decide to put it on a D drive because, space-wise it's more interesting, that's your choice. This is where the archive will be located, so in program data by default. Then, of course, I would need a service account. I think you understand that if I'm going to create group policies on domain controllers, you need to have some privileges to be able to create group policies. And that's what the service account is going to do. So the service account is preferably a domain admin. Technically, it doesn't have to be domain admin. I could work around it with this, group policy owner group. I could also do that, but this is typically, going to be a domain admin account. I could run in a local system if I would be running on a domain controller, because then local system would be perfect on that local system, the domain controller itself. In this case, if I'm installing it on a dedicated member server, I would use a service account, and that's one I create for it, right? The next step is, okay, who will own this archive? So this user or group of people is actually going to be the AGPM admins. So what I typically always do in implementations is I create a group in Active Directory, call this quite simply AGPM admins, and they will have full control to the archive and to all the configuration within AGPM. So nothing special, though that group owns the archive. It means in the delegation model that we talked about, they will be the full admin, full control guys that can access this complete archive. And then eventually it's, which port do you want this server to listen on? And that's the default port, which will automatically be added across the firewall, your Windows firewall at least. And that's it. You choose some languages, multi-language support is there. And then, some details about what are the dependencies that I need. It's based on GPMC, so I will need Group Policy Management Console. I will need some .NET stuff, but that's it. Apart from that, it's just a progress bar, and it's complete. So there's nothing special in this installation. You just have to keep in mind, where do I store this archive, and who will own this archive? The AGPM admins, typically, right? Good. Result of this is nothing more than a simple service. And this service will run under the system context or the service context that you've defined there. So, going into the installation of the client, what's that about? As I said, the client hooks into the Group Policy Management Console. It will add one simple node there, and from there it will do all the administration. So, installation is pretty straightforward. It's just going to be, I accept the license agreement. Again, a path from which I'm going to install, or where I'm going to install the client better. And then, of course, I need to point to the AGPM server. So this is just a fully qualified domain name. And I would put, in this case, not the server name. What I would create an alias in DNS. Makes it easier for me to move around in the future. Typically, we always use this kind of an AGPM alias. And then if today the AGPM server sits here, and tomorrow it sits there because it's a newer version, we don't have to change anything for our clients. So it's just an alias that I've created in DNS. I point to it on that specific port, and that's it. End of the story, multi-language, dependencies, we knew about that, installation, and complete. That's all there is to know about this. This is AGPM. Installation is, call it a piece of cake. And of course, because of this installation, on your Windows 7 box or on your Windows Vista machine, when you now open the Group Policy Management Console, what you will see is just one single node that we've added here, and that's the change control. And this is really where the complete AGPM architecture or infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, sits. And from there, as you can see, we will see all our group policies that we have under our control. And then we will see some others that are not yet controlled by us, the ones in production. I can choose specific group policies to take them under my control. They will appear in the list. And then some other actions like pending templates. And you see the recycler bin that I referred to a minute ago. Okay? So, nothing special about the installation. This is purely for information. What about, which operating systems do you support? Well, it's more about what are the settings inside a group policy that I support. Because I could install this tool probably on any operating system that you will have from Windows Server 2008. And so this is about the server, as you can see, and this is about the client. So typically, you try to be on this side, having R2 as a server for AGPM and having Windows 7 as a client. If you're not yet on Windows 7, okay, no problem. With Windows Vista, I can do this as well, but you'll have some limitations. You know, with Windows Vista, I cannot necessarily see all the settings like group policy preferences, and so you will have those same limitations for viewing policies within AGPM. Okay, so this is merely for your information. So as I said, it's all about the delegation of roles. And should I go into this yet? No. No, I've talked long enough. Let's just show you a couple of things. Let's go up one here. So what I've done here is I have a domain controller. And on this domain controller, I have my group policy management console. You see two things here. What I'm trying to show you is my connection towards that domain controller, and I have one session by which I'm logged in with the GPO admin. He's a AGPM admin. He has full control. He has the role that is able to do whatever you like within AGPM. And then I have this second guy, who's Rudy. Rudy is still a junior admin, or he's actually an application owner. I don't fully trust him. I just delegated him some editor rights. I'll talk about those rights later on. So I'm going to show you their experience depending on the rights that you have. Because, you know, workflow is completely different from my perspective. When I have all rights, there will not be a lot of workflow involved. It's just, you know, do whatever you're supposed to do, and you're able to do that. Whereas when Rudy, as a you know, junior admin, when he tries to do specific actions, he will be limited, and he will be able to send me a request to do that action by email. So what I wanted to really show you is when I go in as the GPO admin, I see this interface which I just talked about. What do we see here? Just let me quickly explain you this. So the first thing you see is all the group policies under my control. Typically, when you do a clean install, this is going to be empty because nothing is under control of AGPM. Everything by default is uncontrolled. What I'm looking at here is what lives in production in Sysvol. So I may decide to take one of those policies under my management. And if this would be relating to, you know, branch caching, great. I can take control of this specific group policy. And so this process is quite straightforward. When I take it under control, you could say, you know, this is now under control of AGPM. Let's copy this even. I even put comment there. So what is that all about? Well, I'm keeping version controls. I'm doing a history. And every time when something happens, I allow you the possibility to specify why things happen, to using the comments. So what is happening here in the background is that this group policy from production is now being copied into the archive. And because of this copy process, and it takes a bit of time on this machine, but because of this copy process, once it's complete, it's no longer uncontrolled, it's now controlled. And so it moves away from this uncontrolled tab into my branch cache controlled group policy. From this point on, I can do offline editing. Offline editing from my AGPM offline in this archive. And of course, as I said, we're trying to respect, you know, the version controls, and we're trying to respect that not two people are working at the same time on this group policy. So for that reason, at all times, we're going to, you know, prevent you from editing this group policy, because you quite simply need to check it out before you can actually edit it. And so that's what I would do. Let's say, you know what, I'm going to make some changes, make changes for, you know what, this is version 2 of this group policy. Why not? And off we go. So I, as a GPO admin, I'm able to check out the group policy. Here you can actually clearly see that it's now being checked out. From this point on, I can now edit it. Of course, when you would look at the history, you would see all these actions. You would see who checked it out, why did he check it out, using the comment. I can see, let's just open this up a little bit. I would be able to see how many computer settings that I had in there, how many user settings I had in there. So I'm able to see an evolution into this group policy. Now, as long as this policy is checked out, no one else can edit it except for me. It is now checked out by myself, being the GPO admin, and that's really the purpose of this complete process. So I now edit it, and the nice thing about this edit is that, it's nothing new. It's the things that you used to do all over. We're using the exact same tools that you had before. It's just a group policy management editor with the policies node and the preference node, and I decide what I want to change in this, new version of the policy. Let's say for some reason I'm deciding to do bits peer caching. Sure, no problem. I close it up, and actually I just moved away. Let's open it up again, because this way I'll show you very briefly what I mentioned a minute ago. At the top, you can actually see that now for a split second, and that's the remark a minute ago about that question, for a split second, while it's checked out, I just temporarily put it in sysvol so I can use the same tools that you know and that you love and hate probably, the same tools to edit it. And so now I could use it for validation in production environment. But from the minute that I no longer need it, and I decide, you know what, I'm done editing, I'm going to check it back in, I'm done. Now it becomes available to other users again to check out, because it was kind of an exclusive only for me. And from this point on, I'm just done. I'm done here with this, checking in, checking out. Anyone else can check it out. And most importantly, I've done all of this offline. I haven't touched production. If I now decide to deploy that in production, of course I can do that. I just right click and I decide to deploy that in production. Maybe I'm going too far, but anyway, I'm going to do this right now. One of the other questions, or one of the other remarks that I gave to that question, saying, how can I test this? Well, maybe you have another environment. Maybe you have a separate domain, a test domain, which represents your production environment. Maybe you've done all this testing and it works fine, but how do I get those group policies from here to there? You don't want to write everything down and decode hundreds of settings again. Well, this is where the export and import comes in. I could take this policy from my test environment, export it into this cab file, take it with me in production, and then import that from there. So I have a very easy way to move policies from one environment to another in a very controlled way. Even dealing with, different factors of different environments, meaning, well, in test environment, the file server is called X, and in production, the file server is called Y. Well, when I move this group policy from A to B, it's really going to talk about this file server called X. And so there would be even a migration and a kind of a translation wizard saying, I see some static hard-coded stuff in this group policy. Would you like me to translate server X into server whatever? And so even that are things that existed already in group policy management, but that's one of the things we can do. So maybe a bit too far-fetched, but let's continue. So we just edited. I can now decide to put that in production. Because if we just have a quick look, branch, cache, headquarters, well, yeah, that's true. This guy, what did I just change? Let me actually see what was in there. I don't know anymore what's in there. So let's have a look at some of the settings in an HTML report. So again, we're going to use the exact same tools that GPMC is using. We're just applying it on our offline archive. And we're going to see all the settings in there. Oh yeah, I have changed the bit stuff. So what I want to show you is that in production, these bits settings, of course, are not yet there. I've just changed that in my offline archive. All the rest only becomes available once I deploy that in production. So for that reason, I see the complete outline of what is in there. And eventually I do see, yeah, allow bits peer caching is enabled. And when I would look in production, let's go into production, because you know this is production. This was about this, was it this guy? I'm not sure actually. Yeah, the headquarter file server. So when I would look at this guy here and look at his settings, of course he would not have that setting yet, because you know I've taken it under my control, and offline in the archive I've just changed it. So let's just stick with this for just a second, so you see my point. So you do see that there is no reference towards the bits peer caching. Any ladies in the room? No. Oh my! Oh, let's quickly continue then. So. One of the things that I want to just show you is, you know, and what about creation of group policies? Creation of group policies is quite straightforward. Again, don't forget, I'm a GPO admin. I have all privileges. I can do whatever I like. So from here on, when I specify GPO for Office, you know, 20, what was it? 2010. Oh yeah, this is going to look nice on Twitter. I'm definitely sure of that. So when I create a group policy, you actually notice that I can create it or only in the archive or both in the archive and production. So when I would push this out into production, it would be just sitting there doing nothing. It's just in the group policy object. It's not linked to any domain, any OU or any site. It's just an empty policy. Again, I could do this from templates, or I could import this from my test environment, which I just talked about. Perfectly possible. But as I'm a GPO admin, and I'm able to do anything I like within AGPM, well, there's no workflow involved for me. If I would repeat the same story for Rudy, and this is our AGPM, you know, editor. He can't do a lot of stuff really. How can you tell? Well, when he connects to an AGPM server, when he creates a new GPO, he's going to see a different experience. So now suddenly he says, you know, you're still requesting to create a new group policy. That's true. It's also for Office 2012, but it's now for SP whatever. Well, 2 maybe. But do notice that in this case, he won't be able to do that because you do not have the permissions to perform this action directly. So I will send an email out to the person that I've made responsible of this infrastructure, in this case, GPO admin. And so, you know, it's going to be in the archive only. And I want to, oh my goodness, I want to work. Fine, you do that. And it's going to send not only the request, but also a notification, which apparently failed here, which is a bit, it's always when you want to show something. Let me quickly check if I've done something wrong here. 1.1, 125. Oh yeah, so apparently I don't like it when my demos go wrong, so I'm going to fix that. Well, yeah. Oh. If I can at least still remember the password. It's not Darth Vader or whatever, or Dart or. Yeah. So let's see. As MTP, of course, if it's not started, it will be difficult to actually send or relay an email. So that's actually what you also noticed here. So the notification failed because it could make a connection. So let's try this again. There's nothing special here. It's a new GPO object. It's going to be my 100th policy. So that's looking way better, of course. Now, because of this, what I actually did is I just sent a request. I was not able to complete it. So I send a notification, a request to my GPO admin. And my request for the creation actually moved into pending. So this group policy that I've just tried to create, you can see it's actually done by Rudy, and that's me for now. I'm not able to, so the administrator has to approve it. So of course the GPO admin, when I go back into his console, so we're now into the GPM, in the GPO admin, when I open his pending, of course he sees the same information, and we're all looking at the same AGPM, but within his email, we should actually see that there is indeed a request for, or from Rudy, for the creation of this group policy 100. So of course his responsibility is to or approve or reject. So we now get into this workflow story where I decide to approve and say, okay, yeah, go do some work. Try to be bitchy. So in this case, we're done. You see it's moved away from pending, and it's now created. And how did I call this? 100. So there it is. So it's now at his disposal. He can now go and check it out, then edit it. Once he's pleased with it, he's going to actually, and let's actually do that. Why not? So Rudy, he's a happy guy. Oh, let's refresh. So in the pending, it's now removed. Rudy sees this new group policy object, which was called what here? This one? Agree? He's going to check it out. Perfect. So it says for version 1. Once he checks this out, he can now edit it. He has the right tools to do all of this. Once he makes a change to it, let's say, and maybe interesting to know, while I'm just clicking a couple of buttons, is that AGPM supports and group policies and group policy preferences. Everything is fully supported. There's no gaps that it doesn't fill. So this archive really contains everything that you can expect it to do. So I check it back in. I'm done. And that's also what you would see in the history, of course. I would see, the approval process that has happened, the request for creation, who did what at what time. So let's just sit for a second and let him do this stuff. So he's now put some settings in there. Maybe I, as a GPO admin, I would like to know what he's changed in there. So I could look at the settings, or I could even look at the differences. How do you mean the differences? Well, that's what you always want to know. There's 100 settings in there. What did he change, or what did he add, or what did he remove, or what did he do? So as a GPO admin, let's move back into this persona, and let's go in here. Let's just have a look. When I double-click, I look at the history. You actually see that it was checked in by Rudy. First of all, he started by the creation request. Rudy requested for creation. Then I approved it. I said, go do some work. The bitchy remark. Then it was created, and he actually checked it out and checked it back in. Only check-ins are recorded for auditing. If I now, as an admin, would like to know what has changed between this phase, because you can actually tell, one setting here, no settings there. What has changed meanwhile? You do notice that when I multi-select, I can look at the differences. So what is the differences? Well, the differences are the differences. I can see what has been added, what has been removed. And I can also see what he would have changed. And so there's specific color codes that you need to know about. And I'll talk about this in a later slide, but you'll notice that there would be green for adding stuff, blue for changing stuff, maybe I've changed something from enabled to disabled, and red when I remove stuff. So it's very clear to see all of this. And again, we're working completely offline. I've just looked between two versions. If I wanted to look between version 1 and version 50 that I keep, why not? Because, all this history, it's great, but how many do you keep? Oh yeah, let me jump just around. We keep about, by default, 9999, well, 4 nines, so a lot of versions. I changed it to 100, so I keep 100 versions of every group policy. Should be enough, right? Unless you have a lot of disk space to spare. So we're keeping that, and if they're older than that, we're also removing it, okay? So what else do we see here? Because that's typically me. I just come into the console to show you 4 tabs, and a half hour later, I'm still talking. So we have group policies. They're now under our control in AGPM. We still have a whole bunch of uncontrolled GPOs. They're still only in the sysvol. We can take them under our control by right-clicking, nothing more than that, and then it moves into the control tab. Meanwhile, you've also seen the pending tab, which is all about, when someone does not have the privilege to do so. For the creation of a group policy, for the deletion of a group policy, maybe when you review the content and he wants to deploy it in production, maybe he doesn't have that privilege either. So you might see a pending create, a pending delete, or a pending deploy. And it's up to the person that has the right privileges to decide if he's going along with this, approve, or if he's going to actually reject, and for what reason he's going to reject that. Okay? Now, when I had the templates tab, what is templates? Well, again, templates are templates. What is a template in Word? It's this kind of a base document that you use for creating new documents. That's the same here. I would have a group policy template, and I can use this as the basis for when I create a new group policy object. So this is then the same like, how was it called in GPMC? GPO starter objects? Yes and no. That's always the right answer. Yes, from the perspective that, it's the base. It's a template. You use it for further reutilization. But it's not the same because in GPMC, starter GPOs, and I hope you know what I'm talking about, starter GPOs, that's what you actually can see here. Starter GPOs were group policy objects delivered by Microsoft based on security guidelines and predefined templates. They just call it a starter object to get started. But it had one major limitation. It only supports administrative templates. So no security settings go in here, just registry keys in the administrative templates, and no group policy preferences. So if you have some template in mind built on settings in the group policy preferences, this can't help you. AGPM does not have that limitation. As I said, it covers everything. It covers group policies itself, their administrative settings, their security settings, their software distribution settings, and it also covers anything that relates to group policy preferences, the second node in there. So everything is covered from there. If you're wondering about, how do I create such a template? Well, I could create it from an existing one. I could decide to save this one as a template because I find this the good basis, for any Internet Explorer 8 configuration. So I could save this as a template saying, what, this is my IE8 template. And so here he goes. He's now available in the templates. Because of this, if I or any other GPO administrator comes in and he would like to reuse this, why not? He can do so. And then, of course, we have the recycler bin. Recycler bin does what it's supposed to, and you're hoping to. It does when I delete a group policy. Let's actually delete one. Let's say this test GPO doesn't look nice in the demo, so let's just delete it. Again, do you want to delete it from the archive only, or there would even be an option for the second one, for production as well. Why is it grayed out? Because this group policy only lived in my archive. If it would also exist in production, I would have the capability to delete it as well. So let's actually delete this. Nothing special there. I'm entitled to do anything I like. It's no longer under my control, and if it would have been under my control, I would have even deleted it. Let's take another one that is maybe, that is probably in production. This guy here. Let's actually delete it as well. You now see the option there, because it exists in production and in the archive. Let's delete both of them. So both in my archive, I'm going to delete it, and in production. So Brussels IE8. So it's now gone. So it was still there. Let's refresh. So it was here. Let's refresh. Brussels IE8 is now gone. And of course, that's the purpose of the recycler bin. Anything that I delete, I can from here on, or, well, that's probably the idea, restore, or if you no longer need it, it's just taking up space, I could destroy it. So when I restore, and let's do this, when I restore it and say, okay, my mistake, someone actually still needed that. What is now restoring is not in production, but just putting it back in control of myself. I can now again take control of it. So it didn't do anything in production. That's never ever the purpose of this product. If I now decide that it should go back in production, it's now up to me to deploy it. And once I deploy it, you know, I'm back to the situation as before. So let's do that. It's now going to push it out into the sysvol, and I'm back to the exact situation as a minute ago, right? That's the idea of the recycle bin. Okay. So far, any questions? Question here?
When you were talking about differences, what's the granularity? I mean, if you change a list, I don't know, trusted zones, internet site, so somebody will add a site and another will delete. Can we see?
Yes, you can see all of that. I can exactly see what has been added, what has been removed. You could make a kind of a, you know, in the end this is all transformed into XML. And so it's going to compare two XMLs. And so those values are somewhere in there. And so he's going to show, you know, this field about trusted sites, for example, contained 20 items here. And here, well, a lot less. So he's going to show you what's missing there. So he might not show you site 2, but you'll see that, hey, here's there's only 2, and here there's 20. Make sense what I'm saying? Okay. Another question.
When you restart deleted policy, is it...
If you restart what?
If you restart a deleted GPO?
Yeah.
Is it restoring security settings as well?
He's actually restoring the same GUID. He's restoring the same anything. Yeah, so including the security settings. So let me try and show you that again. When he's restoring that, of course, it only happens at deployment time. I hope you agree on that. But when I decide to deploy it back, there was this checkbox here, or this button and checkbox, that normally would be available to me. If it was a group policy linked to specific OUs or domains, he would have recorded that, and it would also allow me to restore that as well. I could then select if I want to also restore the links or just the object as a whole. In my example, this was just an object sitting there doing nothing. It was not linked to neither an OU, neither a domain, and so that's why by default it's actually grayed out. But yes, it does restore everything to the exact same state. Okay? Other questions? Good. I think I need to maybe talk about another slide or something. Yeah. Don't worry, I only have 10 slides or something. So, as I said, we're working with this role-based delegation model. And by default in AGPM, there's 4 roles. So I think that you understand the purpose of these delegation model is so we can be very granular on who can do what. And we try to make it a bit easy by default giving you 4 roles. You have the full control role, and that is what I call the AGPM admins. They're able to do anything you like, from creation of GPO to the deployment to, you know, the deletion, but also including any configuration changes in AGPM itself. Like, for example, I only want to keep 100 version of a group policy instead of the 4 nines. So I have this first role, which is full control. Then the second role that we have is an editor. And an editor, he can just edit a group policy. He cannot create one. He cannot deploy it in production. He can just change the content. Even when he's done checking out this policy again, he cannot deploy it in production. He has to ask someone else. So preferably, that person who will approve his requests will first review what he put in there. So we have these 2 other roles. A reviewer, or a viewer, if you want to call it like that, is a person who cannot change anything but just view the settings. And then eventually, when he's pleased with what you've put in there, he can approve, the approval role. He could approve that, yeah, sure, put this in production, and actually the AGPM service account will push that into the sysvol and into your Active Directory, right? So let's just show something about that as well. We're on a roll. So, where do I see all of this? Well, it starts here. It starts at my domain delegation tab. And you know, by the end, Wolf covered all the tabs, don't worry. It's not that big of a product, but it's pretty interesting what it can do. So in here, at the top, I'll cover it straight away as well. This is where I'm going to send emails from using a specific email server, authenticated or not authenticated. And at the bottom, this is where you see the roles, the delegation model. So I've actually created some groups in Active Directory, nothing special there. I've created a group for, you know, having full control. You see those 4 roles coming back: full control, approver, editor, and then a reviewer. So I've just named reviewers a group, and I've mapped that to this specific role. Pretty straightforward, really. You just select a user or a group, preferably, and then you specify which kind of role they're going to have. If that is not granular enough for you, no problem. I can go into the advanced view, and I'm just looking like, you know, on NTFS permissions in the advanced view, I can really see at a very granular level, you know, these editors, what are they able to do? They're able to, don't be scared at the front row, it's not going to kill you, the screen. So what you see here is just, you know, they're able to list and read, but for some reason, they can also create it, and you don't like that, no problem. You take it away. It's now no longer a real editor. It's kind of an editor without the privilege to create a template, but you know, I can customize it. I can do whatever I feel like doing. Okay? So once I've done this, I've just set up who has what rights, who has full control, who can change all this stuff. And then for each policy that I now take under control in AGPM, automatically those roles, and let me see if I can move this up. I can't. So I'm going to try and put this in full screen. That's a little bit better, because I wanted to show you. Oh, it doesn't help me either, I think. Yeah. Well, the bottom line is that from now, every group policy that I take under my control automatically will add those people to that group policy as being privileged to do what they're supposed to be doing. Now, if this is a specific GPO for, you know, it's Brussels, and probably in Brussels I have some IT guys there, and I want to delegate it to only those guys, no problem. Anyone that can review, but on top of that, I've also decided to add in the Brussels admin as an editor, so that they can manage all their policies that are dealing for this site of Brussels. But I've only given them review and editor, so they cannot deploy it in production. They have to come and talk to me. I deal with GPOs. When I'm pleased with it, I will actually approve their request, and it will go into their production environment. So it's quite simple, really. I decide to just take, you know, I have a search there. Let's say I have policies for Ghent. I want to take all these policies, and multi-select also works fine. I'm just going to take them under our control. It's now under control of AGPM. It will get copied back into the archive. It's now available for me, controlled, to edit. I can now, under these group policies, decide, you know, these are all for people in Ghent. Let's also give the Ghent admins privileges on those group policies. So they don't have to bother me. They don't have to send me an email asking me, you know, can you do this or can you do that? No, let's make them, so they're now gone. No more Ghent group policies. They're now all under my control. So let's filter this out. Let's again select this. And oh yeah, by the way, this search, it's pretty funky. I can do whatever search I want to do on any field. If it's about who changed it, what the date is, or you know, if it's a WMI filter, even I can work with, you know, give me the state as being checked in. I just have to use double brackets. That would also do what that would also checked in. That would also do what I'm supposed to be seeing. So it's pretty powerful, but I'll try to show you that for those Ghent GPOs, let's now give the Ghent admins privileges. So it's quite simple. The default 4 groups are there. I now add Ghent admins. I want them to make an editor, so they can edit all the policies for Ghent. And that's it. As you can now see, for each of those policies, they have been added. Other group policies, of course, they don't have any privilege on. They're not in the list, but from the minute I look at a policy for Ghent, I do see them involved there. If they go through this checkout, check-in, they have full control on this policy for changing the content, that is. Okay? Now, there's one thing that's very crucial that I haven't talked about, is that when you actually take a group policy under control of AGPM, we're going to, by default, change the permissions on this group policy, and we're going to add these 4 groups in there. Of course, we're going to respect if you're doing security filtering, you know, if you apply a group policy only to a group sales or to the group of computers of sales, we're going to respect that, and we're going to keep that, but we're changing the security so that only the people that's supposed to be having access, role-based access, have access. But we're also doing something else. In production, we're now also changing the permissions there. And this is quite important to mention. So when you now, let's have a look at the Ghent admin. So I'm back in GPMC, you know, where all my group policies live. You know, I'm a full admin, so I can edit policies. But have you noticed how I can no longer edit the Ghent group policy object? Why is that? Well, it's obvious that once I take them under control in my infrastructure with AGPM, I don't want you to go behind my back and change all those things, and me thinking that I'm fully compliant, everything backed up, archive, version control, and then you just change everything behind my back. So what we're really doing in the back, when we take it under our control, is that we also change the permissions on the group policy in production for as long as it stays offline. From the minute that we deploy it back in production, we are still going to respect, you know, if you do some kind of a delegation and you've actually scoped it to, let's say, salespeople here at the bottom, we would still respect that. But we're taking away the rights for you to change it in production so that it's really controlled what is happening with the group policies. Now, how do we do that? Well, yeah, it's something that happens transparently, but it's because of this. So with the production delegation tab, you actually will add permissions or change permissions once you push out a group policy in production. So no matter which policy it is, from the minute that it is pushed out in production, we will add on top of that our permissions. And if there would have been a domain admin full control, we're going to change it into read because we say it should be read. That's why my group policies in production, some of them I can change, and some of them I can no longer change, because when I look at their specific privileges, you do see that they're all set to read, and you also see that AGPM added itself in there. The service account, which is now the one that is pushing out and pulling in the group policies from your Active Directory, he's the one in charge of all of that. Okay? So this is pretty important as well. By default, it is not put to read. So I'm already telling you, if you're going to play around with this, you're not going to have the same result as I do. By default, you know, an enterprise admin has full control, and a domain admin also has full control. In this scenario, or in most scenarios, I don't think you want to have that. If the people that are GPO admins are not necessarily domain admins and vice versa, you may want to change that. And so you simply remove it from the list, you add it back in there, and you specify the permission you want to give them. And in this case, read is sufficient to not break other stuff, right? Which is also important. Okay. So I've talked about this, talked about that. Oh yeah, didn't talk about that yet, but I think it's quite straightforward. This is, in the end, the AGPM client that we need to configure, and we need to tell them to where to connect. It's connecting to a DNS alias. If you want to make your life easy, there's also a group policy setting. Sorry for that. So through group policies, I can already point or pre-populate on any machine or any administration workstation. I could populate the name so that people don't have to fill this out. Maybe your application owner who's dealing with group policies does not necessarily know which one is the AGPM server. I don't need to tell him that. I just push it to him using group policies, and that's it. It's just an ADM that has been delivered as part of AGPM. Okay, so let's go back. So quite granular, I think I've shown you that. Oh yeah, that's something I really wanted to show you, because chances are pretty big that you're going to set this up and you're going to say, oh, after 5 seconds already starts happening, It all seems so very simple when he showed it, and the first thing I get is access denied. When you're installing it as an administrator or even domain admin, and you had not specified yourself as the owner of the archive, you have no privileges, no roles, no access. And so if an administrator, domain administrator, who did not install this product, who has no privileges within AGPM, he's not a full control reviewer, approver, or editor, I'm sorry, you will not have access. And it's pretty straightforward. Access denied, that's it. It's not a bug. It's supposed to be, well, it's maybe not that user-friendly, but it's doing what it's supposed to do. So don't be alarmed by that. You just need to connect using the correct user, which has privileges within AGPM. And so it was all about the workflow. I think we've covered already quite a few of those things. It's a good kind of a recap or a review. So everything starts by taking control. You have all these group policies sitting in production. They're not controlled. So, you want to have them in AGPM. So you right-click, you take it under control, and from this point on, you can now, in a very organized way, have version control on it, because you're actually checking out, editing, and then checking it back in once you're done. As long as it's checked out, you have exclusive access. Even if, let's say you checked it out today, and for some reason you can't make it to work, well, it's exclusive for you. Well, another GPO admin can come in and say, let's undo the checkout so that you can, as another person, your colleague, can do his work. But it's all about version control. Check it out, edit, and then check it back in. Now, of course, if you don't have any privileges to create a group policy or to deploy it in production, you have to do a request for creation, deployment, deletion, etc. And that gets into this, workflow of sending an email, which is notifying you about, hey, there's an action pending, and you need to take action on that, whether it be approve or reject. Those are choices that you have to make yourself. Of course, reporting is pretty important. Before you want to deploy in production, you may want to know what you're deploying in production. You may want to check what are the differences. I've showed you differences there. I've showed you the settings. You can see the versions. What's the difference between version 1 and version 5, as you wish. So that's the portion about the reporting. And eventually, when you see that everything is well using your report, you can decide to actually push it out in production, and the AGPM service will do it for you. Again, remember, when we deploy it or push it out in production, we're changing continuously, we're changing those permissions on the GPO, so that a domain admin, as you configure it as I, has no privileges whatsoever. If you're not known in AGPM within the roles and have no permissions in there, you can do nothing with those group policies in production. It's all going through AGPM. So, everything, of course, happens offline. So the controlling of GPOs, as I said, you take it from production where it's uncontrolled, you now control it, it's just a copy, and that's where you're going to make all the changes on. If you don't have any privileges for editing it or deploying it, you're going to send a request. And a request is typically an email that you're going to send to your GPO admin. Then, of course, you get into the editing. Editing, as I said, is offline. You can only do it when the GPO is controlled and when it is actually checked out. So once it's checked out, I can now edit it. Once I'm pleased with it, I check it back out. I check it back in. Sorry for the confusion there. And that's all I need to do. Then of course these requests, they relate to, when do I generate a request? Well, when you don't have the permission. When you don't have the permission to take a group policy under control, or when you don't have the permission to create one or deploy one or delete one, that's when the request actually moves into the pending tab. And it sends an email to the admin. Then it's up to the admin to actually say, you know what, I approve or I reject. That's what I've shown you. So for the deployment, I think I already explained most of this. An editor, he can not deploy. So when an editor selects deploy, what he's going to do is not deploy, but send an email to the administrator saying, I'm trying to deploy. Please approve my request. So he goes into the pending tab and he actually approves that request, which eventually pushes it out in production. Okay? And so this is also what I've shown you. It's the differences report, where you actually can see, this is a better example, the stuff that has been added in green, the stuff that has been removed in red, of course. And if you make changes to an existing setting, as I said, when you move something from enabled to disabled, that's perfectly possible as well. So before I get into any questions, let me see if there's anything left that maybe I should talk about. So I've showed you this. So I have the history settings, check it out, import, delete, deploy, export. Oh yeah, I can change some labels, labeling is like you want to add comment to it. If you say, I'm now ready for deployment, it's just an extra information you put on there, labels. And then what else? Renaming, that's also perfectly possible. Refreshing, that's more or less it. Yeah, so hold on, let me quickly check one other. Yeah, let's have a look at the history. So I think I've showed you most of that. So in the history, you can actually see the progress of a group policy object. I can also see the unique versions. So maybe even though you've checked it in 20 times, it hasn't changed meanwhile, that's when I could see unique versions. I can do the exact same thing here. Notice that at the bottom I still have my settings and differences button. So if I had multiple unique versions, I can multi-select and decide what I want to see, differences on there or not. So yeah, talked about that as well. Pending, there's nothing much. Oh yeah, there's something else I want to show you. Even with, so of course, I think it's obvious it hooks into the GPMC. But it hooks in not only in this one node, it also hooks in into several other places. You notice maybe that there's now a tab here that was not there before. That of course is because of AGPM. So we're looking at the history for this specific group policy object. So I'm able to do all of those operations again, even if it's through AGPM. If I'm entitled to do stuff because I have a role that allows me to do that within AGPM, I can do that. Okay? So there's this history which is added, and that's of course the same over here.